The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and red as Sarah Mitchell pulled her rental car to the side of Highway 160. She had been driving for 3 hours straight from Flagstaff, chasing a story that could make her career as a journalist. The tip had come from an anonymous source claiming that ancient Navajo burial grounds were being illegally excavated by treasure hunters near Monument Valley. Sarah stepped out of her car and stretched her tired muscles. The desert air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. She had always been drawn to stories about Native American culture, partly because of her grandmother's Cherokee heritage. This assignment felt personal, not just professional. Her editor at the Phoenix Tribune had been skeptical about sending her on what he called another wild goose chase. But Sarah had convinced him that illegal artifact trafficking was a serious issue worth investigating. She had spent weeks researching similar cases across the Southwest, building sources within various tribal communities. As she checked her GPS, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. A pickup truck was approaching fast, kicking up a trail of red dirt behind it. Sarah grabbed her camera from the passenger seat and pretended to be taking pictures of the landscape. She had learned long ago that looking like a tourist was often the best cover when investigating sensitive stories. The truck slowed as it passed her, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the driver through the dusty windshield. He was a Native American man, probably in his 30s, with long black hair tied back and wearing a denim jacket. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something that made her stomach tighten, suspicion mixed with what looked like fear. The truck continued down the highway, but Sarah noticed it pull over about a quarter-mile ahead. The driver got out and seemed to be making a phone call. She decided to wait a few minutes before continuing her journey, not wanting to seem like she was following him. While she waited, Sarah reviewed her notes. According to her source, the illegal digging was happening near a place called Whispering Rock, about 10 miles off the main highway. The area was supposed to be protected tribal land, but recent budget cuts had reduced patrols, making it easier for thieves to operate. 20 minutes later, Sarah was driving down a narrow dirt road that wound through towering red sandstone formations. The landscape was breathtaking but also somehow ominous. She had read about the spiritual significance of this land to the Navajo people, how certain places were considered sacred and not to be disturbed. Her rental car bounced over rocks and deep ruts, the city vehicle clearly not designed for this terrain. Twice she had to get out and move fallen branches from her path. The isolation was complete now. No cell phone signal. No other vehicles, just the endless expanse of desert and stone. After an hour of difficult driving, Sarah spotted what she was looking for. In a small valley between two mesas, she could see the telltale signs of recent excavation: piles of disturbed earth, scattered tools, and what looked like a makeshift camp. She parked behind a large boulder and grabbed her equipment: camera, notebook, and a small digital recorder. As she approached the site on foot, staying low and using the natural cover of rocks and bushes, Sarah's heart began to race. This was it, the evidence she needed to expose the illegal operation. She could see several deep holes that had been dug into what appeared to be an ancient burial site. Pottery fragments and other artifacts were scattered carelessly around the area. She began taking pictures, documenting everything she could see. The scope of the damage was worse than she had imagined. Dozens of graves appeared to have been disturbed, their contents looted by people who had no regard for the cultural and spiritual significance of what they were destroying. Lost in her work, Sarah didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind until it was too late. A rough hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. She found herself face to face with 3 men, 2 white men in their 40s wearing dirty work clothes, and the Native American man she had seen in the pickup truck earlier. Well, what do we have here?" said the larger of the 2 white men, a heavy-set guy with graying hair and cruel eyes. "Looks like we got ourselves a reporter." Sarah tried to remain calm, clutching her camera protectively. "I'm just a tourist taking pictures of the scenery," she said, hoping her voice didn't betray her fear. The man laughed harshly. "Tourist, my ass. We saw you sneaking around taking pictures of our operation. That's a real expensive camera for a tourist." He nodded to his partner, a thin man with nervous eyes and dirty blonde hair. "Tommy, take her camera and see what she's been photographing." The Navajo man spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. This is wrong, Jake. We agreed no one would get hurt. She's just doing her job. Jake's expression darkened. Your job, Joseph, is to keep lookouts posted so this kind of thing doesn't happen. You screwed up and now we have to deal with it. He turned back to Sarah. You picked the wrong day to play Nancy Drew, lady. Sarah's mind raced as she looked around for escape routes. The nearest cover was about 50 yards away, too far to reach before they could catch her. She had to think fast. Look, I understand you're upset, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But I'm not here to cause trouble for you personally. I'm investigating reports of artifact theft, and I think we might be able to work something out. Jake stepped closer, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath despite it being barely noon. The only thing we're going to work out is how to make sure you don't cause us any more problems. Joseph looked increasingly uncomfortable. Jake, we can't just shut up, Jake snapped. You brought us to this site. You promised it would be safe. Now fix the problem or find yourself a new partnership. The tension in the air was thick as the three men argued among themselves about what to do with their unexpected visitor. Sarah realized that her life might very well depend on the outcome of their discussion. She had stumbled into something much more dangerous than she had anticipated, and now she was trapped in the middle of the desert with nowhere to run. The argument between Jake and Joseph grew more heated as Tommy rifled through Sarah's camera, deleting photos with obvious satisfaction. Sarah watched helplessly as her evidence disappeared, one image at a time. She knew she needed to find a way to survive this encounter and somehow get word out about what was happening here. These pictures show everything, Tommy said, holding up the camera. The whole operation clear as day. If these had made it to a newspaper. Jake grabbed the camera and smashed it against a rock, the expensive equipment shattering into pieces. Problem solved, he said with a grim smile. Now we just need to deal with the photographer. Joseph stepped between Jake and Sarah, his jaw set in determination. I told you from the beginning, no violence. My grandfather's spirit watches over this place, and I won't have innocent blood spilled here. Your grandfather's spirit? Jake laughed mockingly. Your grandfather's spirit is probably spinning in his grave, knowing you're helping us dig up his ancestors for money. The words hit Joseph like a physical blow, and Sarah could see the shame and anger warring in his expression. She realized that this man was not like the others. He was conflicted about what they were doing, possibly desperate enough to betray his own heritage but not comfortable with it. Sarah decided to take a chance. He's right, you know, she said quietly to Joseph. This is a sacred place. These aren't just archaeological artifacts. They're your people's ancestors. Jake backhanded Sarah across the face, the blow sending her stumbling backward. Nobody asked for your opinion, lady. He turned to Joseph. And nobody asked for a lecture about dead Indians. We have a business arrangement and we're going to see it through. Joseph's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't move. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. She pressed her advantage, speaking directly to him despite Jake's growing anger. What would your grandfather think about you helping them? She asked. What would he say about you letting them destroy the resting place of your ancestors? Shut her up, Jake shouted, but Joseph held up a hand. She has a right to speak, Joseph said quietly, just as my grandfather had a right to be buried in peace. The standoff stretched for several tense moments before Jake finally exploded. Fine. You want to play the noble savage? Tommy, get the rope from the truck. We'll tie her up until we finish our business here, then figure out what to do with her. Tommy jogged toward their vehicle, which was parked behind a large rock formation about 100 yards away. Sarah realized this might be her only chance to escape, but Jake was watching her too closely. Joseph, however, seemed lost in thought, staring at the disturbed graves around them. When Tommy returned with the rope, Jake grabbed Sarah's arms and forced them behind her back. She struggled briefly but knew it was useless. Jake was much stronger than she was, and fighting would only make him angrier. This is a mistake, Joseph said, as Jake bound Sarah's wrists. People will come looking for her. Not if they don't know where to look, Jake replied. We'll finish digging up this site, sell what we found, and be long gone before anyone realizes she's missing. As Jake tied her ankles, Sarah tried to memorize every detail of the operation. Even if she couldn't photograph it anymore, she could still report what she had seen, assuming she survived to tell the story. She counted at least 20 disturbed graves, and she had seen boxes of artifacts near their camp. Tommy was getting nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting someone to appear. How long until the tribal police patrol this area again? He asked Joseph. Not for another week, Joseph replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe longer. Jake finished securing Sarah and stood up, dusting off his hands. Perfect. We'll have this place cleaned out and be on our way to Phoenix by tomorrow night. He looked down at Sarah. As for you, we'll decide what to do after we finish our work. The three men walked away, leaving Sarah alone near the excavation site. She immediately began testing the ropes, looking for any weakness, but Jake had done a thorough job. The knots were tight, and struggling only seemed to make them tighter. The desert sun was climbing higher, and Sarah could already feel the heat beginning to build. She knew that exposure would become a serious problem if she remained tied up for too long. She also knew that her chances of survival decreased dramatically once the men finished their digging, and had to decide what to do with their witness. From her position on the ground, Sarah could see the men returning to their work with renewed urgency. They had clearly decided to finish the job as quickly as possible and deal with the complications later. Jake and Tommy attacked the remaining undisturbed graves with shovels and picks, while Joseph worked more slowly, handling each artifact with obvious reluctance. Hours passed, and the sun reached its zenith. Sarah's mouth was dry and sweat stung her eyes. She had managed to work one hand slightly looser in its bonds, but not enough to make a real difference. The men took occasional breaks, drinking water from bottles they kept in the shade, but no one offered her any. It was during one of these breaks that Sarah heard something that made her heart race with hope. The distant sound of an approaching engine. Jake heard it too and immediately began shouting orders. Get those tools out of sight. Tommy, cover up the fresh digging with those tarps. Joseph, get up on that ridge and see who's coming. The men scrambled to hide evidence of their work, but Sarah could see panic in their movements. They hadn't expected visitors, and they weren't prepared for this complication. Joseph climbed up a small hill and peered over the edge, then came running back down. It's tribal police, he called out. 2 officers in a patrol vehicle heading this way. Jake's face went white. How did they know to come here? Maybe someone saw the reporter's car on the main road, Tommy suggested. Sarah's rental car was still parked behind the boulder where she had left it, clearly visible to anyone who knew where to look. She realized that her disappearance might have been noticed sooner than the men had anticipated. Jake looked around frantically, then his eyes settled on Sarah. We need to get her out of sight. Now. He nodded to Tommy. Help me move her. The 2 men grabbed Sarah under her arms and dragged her toward a deep hole they had dug earlier that day. Her heart began pounding as she realized what they intended to do. You can't hide me in there, she protested. The heat, the lack of air, you'll kill me. Jake's expression was cold. That might not be such a bad thing at this point. Despite Joseph's earlier protests about violence, he helped carry Sarah to the excavated grave. The hole was about 6 feet deep and just wide enough for a person to lie down in. Ancient pottery shards and bone fragments littered the bottom. Please, Sarah begged as they lowered her into the hole. The police are already here. Hiding me won't solve anything. But Jake was beyond rational thought now. He grabbed a large canvas tarp and began spreading it over the top of the hole, blocking out most of the sunlight and leaving Sarah in near darkness. She could hear him piling rocks and dirt on top of the tarp to hold it in place. The temperature inside the makeshift prison immediately began to rise, and the air grew thick and stifling. Sarah realized with growing terror that she might not survive long enough to be rescued. Officer Maria Begay stepped out of the patrol vehicle and surveyed the desert landscape with the trained eye of someone who had spent years patrolling these remote areas. Her partner, Officer Tom Yazzie, walked around to join her, both of them immediately noticing the rental car parked behind the large boulder. City plates, Tom observed, checking his notebook. Phoenix Tribune called this morning about a missing reporter. Sarah Mitchell, age 28, driving a blue sedan. Maria nodded, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her service weapon. Years of experience had taught her to be cautious when investigating abandoned vehicles in remote locations. Too many bad things happened in places where no one could hear you scream. Tracks lead that way, she said, pointing toward the valley where the illegal excavation was taking place. Multiple vehicles, recent activity. From their hiding spot behind some rocks, Jake watched the 2 officers with growing desperation. The tribal police were getting closer to discovering the excavation site, and Sarah was hidden just 50 yards from where they would likely search first. We need to create a distraction, he whispered to Tommy and Joseph. Get them looking somewhere else. Joseph shook his head. It's over, Jake. They're going to find everything anyway. We should just surrender and hope for leniency. Speak for yourself, Jake snarled. I've got 2 strikes already. A 3rd conviction means life in prison under the 3 strikes law. I'm not going down for digging up some old bones. Meanwhile, trapped in the suffocating darkness of the excavated grave, Sarah was fighting to remain conscious. The temperature inside her prison had risen dramatically, and each breath seemed to contain less oxygen than the last. The canvas tarp above her head absorbed and concentrated the desert heat, turning her hiding place into an oven. She had managed to work her right hand almost free from the rope binding her wrists, but the effort had exhausted her already depleted energy reserves. The ancient pottery shards beneath her cut into her back through her thin shirt, and she could taste dust and desperation in her mouth. Above her, she could hear muffled voices and footsteps as the officers searched the area. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The tarp and the weight of rocks and dirt on top of it muffled any sound she might make. Officer Begay crouched beside one of the disturbed graves and examined the evidence with growing anger. As a member of the Navajo Nation Police, she had seen too many cases of artifact theft and grave robbing. Each desecrated burial site represented not just a crime, but a personal violation of her people's spiritual beliefs. This is extensive, she said to her partner. Professional operation, not just casual pot hunters. Someone with knowledge of burial practices guided this dig. Tom was photographing the scene with his digital camera, documenting the scope of the damage. Looks like they cleared out at least 15 graves. This represents thousands of years of our ancestors' history. The sound of the officers' voices carried down to Sarah in her underground prison. She summoned every ounce of strength she had left and managed to kick weakly against the sides of the hole. The sound was muffled, but she hoped it might be enough to attract attention. Joseph heard the faint noise and felt his blood turn to ice. He knew exactly what it was. Sarah was still alive down there, but barely. The heat and lack of oxygen would kill her soon if someone didn't remove the tarp. I have to tell them, he whispered to Jake. Jake grabbed Joseph's arm with iron fingers. You say one word, and I'll tell them this whole operation was your idea. Who do you think they'll believe? A white man with a criminal record or a Navajo who led thieves to his own ancestors' graves? The moral weight of Jake's words hit Joseph like a physical blow. He was trapped between his conscience and his survival, knowing that either choice would destroy him. If he stayed silent, an innocent woman would die. If he spoke up, he would spend the rest of his life in prison, branded as a traitor to his own people. Officer Begay was methodically searching the area, moving in an expanding spiral pattern from the main excavation site. Her years of training had taught her to be thorough, and something about this scene felt wrong beyond the obvious crime. Tom, she called to her partner, come look at this. She was standing beside the hole where Sarah was hidden, studying the ground carefully. The earth here looked different from the surrounding area, more recently disturbed, and the pattern was wrong for a typical grave. This doesn't look like the others, she said. The shape is different, and there's no pottery or bone fragments scattered around. Tom joined her and knelt to examine the area more closely. You're right, and look at these drag marks in the dirt. Something heavy was pulled over here recently. Sarah heard the voices directly above her now, and used her last reserves of strength to kick against the sides of the hole again. This time the sound was slightly louder and both officers heard it. Did you hear that? Maria asked, drawing her weapon. Sounded like it came from underground, Tom replied, also drawing his gun. They began pulling away the rocks and dirt that held down the tarp, working with urgent efficiency. Sarah could see tiny slivers of daylight beginning to appear around the edges of her prison. From his hiding place, Jake watched in horror as the officers discovered Sarah's location. He knew that once they found her alive, she would be able to identify all 3 men involved in the illegal excavation. His dreams of a big payday from selling the stolen artifacts were evaporating along with his chances of avoiding a life sentence. That's it, he said to Tommy. We run now, while they're distracted. But Joseph remained frozen in place, watching as the officers worked to free Sarah. Part of him felt relief that she would be rescued, but another part dreaded what would happen to him once she told her story. Officer Begay grabbed one corner of the tarp and pulled it away, revealing Sarah's pale, sweating face in the dim light of the hole. The reporter's eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment Maria thought they might be too late. Ma'am, can you hear me? She called down into the hole. We're police officers. You're safe now. Sarah's eyes fluttered open and she tried to speak but could only manage a weak croak. The sudden influx of fresh air and daylight was overwhelming after hours of suffocating darkness. "Get the emergency medical kit from the vehicle," Maria ordered her partner, "and radio for a helicopter. We need to get her to a hospital as soon as possible." Tom ran toward their patrol car while Maria climbed down into the hole to assess Sarah's condition. The reporter's pulse was weak but steady, and her skin was dangerously hot from heat exposure. "Don't try to talk," Maria said gently, as she cut the ropes binding Sarah's wrists and ankles. "Just try to breathe normally. Help is coming." As Maria worked to free Sarah from her bonds, the reporter managed to whisper a single word that made the officer's blood run cold. 3. Maria immediately understood. There were 3 suspects involved in this crime, and they were probably still in the area. She drew her radio and called for backup, knowing that she and Tom were potentially outnumbered and outgunned. But when she looked around the excavation site, she could see no sign of the criminals. They had vanished into the vast desert landscape, leaving behind only their victim and the evidence of their crimes. What Maria didn't know was that Jake and Tommy were already a mile away, running toward their backup vehicle that they had hidden in a distant canyon, and Joseph was following them, driven not by loyalty but by the terrible knowledge that he had nowhere else to go. The 3 men were free for now, but they had left behind a witness who had seen their faces and could identify them. The hunt was about to begin. The medical helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and noise, its rotor blades creating a miniature sandstorm across the excavation site. Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher, still weak but conscious enough to grip Officer Begay's hand as the paramedics worked to stabilize her condition. "Joseph," she whispered through cracked lips. "The Navajo man. He tried to help me. He didn't want violence." Maria leaned closer to hear Sarah's words over the helicopter noise. This information could be crucial to the investigation, especially if it meant one of the suspects might be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. "What else can you remember?" Maria asked quickly, knowing the medical crew would soon take Sarah to the hospital. "Jake," Sarah said weakly. "The leader. White man, graying hair. Desperate. Said he had 2 strikes already." She paused to catch her breath. Tommy, blonde hair, nervous. And Joseph. He was ashamed. This place meant something to him. The helicopter lifted off with Sarah aboard, leaving Maria and Tom alone at the crime scene. Backup units were on their way, but it would be at least an hour before they arrived at this remote location. The 2 officers had work to do in the meantime. "We need to process this scene carefully," Maria told her partner. "These guys were professionals, but they were in a hurry when they left. They might have left behind evidence we can use." Tom was already examining the abandoned tools and equipment scattered around the excavation site. "They left everything," he observed. "Shovels, picks, metal detectors, even some of the artifacts they dug up. They must have panicked when they realized we were coming." Maria photographed the scene systematically, documenting each disturbed grave and cataloging the artifacts that had been left behind. The scope of the desecration was heartbreaking. Generations of her ancestors had been disturbed for nothing more than greed. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in a remote canyon, Jake was having a heated argument with his 2 partners. They had reached their backup vehicle, an old pickup truck hidden beneath a camouflage tarp, but now they faced the reality of their situation. "We can't go back to Phoenix," Jake said, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "That reporter saw all our faces. The police will have our descriptions within hours." Tommy was sitting on a rock, his head in his hands. "Maybe we should just turn ourselves in. If we cooperate, they might go easier on us." Jake stopped pacing and stared at Tommy with contempt. "Go easier on us? We kidnapped a reporter and left her to die in a hole. They'll throw away the key." Joseph had remained silent during most of their flight from the excavation site, but now he spoke up. "She was right about what my grandfather would think. I dishonored him and all our ancestors. Save the guilt trip for someone who cares," Jake snapped. "Right now we need to figure out how to get out of this mess." The 3 men had worked together for almost 2 years, hitting archaeological sites across Arizona and New Mexico. Jake had the contacts to sell stolen artifacts. Tommy had the equipment and technical knowledge, and Joseph provided inside information about sacred sites that were likely to contain valuable items. Their partnership had been profitable but uneasy from the start. Jake was a career criminal who saw Native American burial grounds as nothing more than treasure troves waiting to be plundered. Tommy was a failed archaeology graduate student who had convinced himself that he was preserving history, not stealing it. And Joseph was a man caught between two worlds, needing money for his sick mother's medical bills but hating himself for what he was doing to get it. We need to split up, Jake decided. 3 men traveling together will be too easy to spot. We'll meet in Denver in a week and figure out our next move. Tommy looked up with hope in his eyes. Maybe by then the heat will have died down. Maybe they won't even file federal charges. Jake laughed bitterly. Federal charges? Tommy, we kidnapped a federal journalist on tribal land. The FBI, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and tribal police are all going to be looking for us. This is as bad as it gets. Joseph stood up and walked toward the truck. I'm not running anymore. I'm going back. Like hell you are, Jake said, pulling a pistol from his jacket. You know too much about our operation. About our other sites, our buyers, everything. You're not going anywhere. The sight of the gun changed everything. Tommy scrambled away from the rock where he had been sitting, and Joseph slowly raised his hands. Jake, put the gun away. Tommy pleaded. This is crazy. We're partners, remember? Partners don't threaten to turn each other in. Jake replied, keeping the weapon pointed at Joseph. And partners don't get religion when things get tough. Joseph looked at Jake with sad eyes. You never understood what those places meant to us. To you, they were just sources of profit. But they were our ancestors, Jake. They were sacred. Sacred doesn't pay the bills, Jake said coldly. And neither does guilt. The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Joseph made a decision that surprised both of his partners. Instead of pleading for his life or trying to bargain, he began to speak in Navajo, his voice rising and falling in what sounded like a prayer or chant. Jake didn't understand the words, but something about Joseph's tone and posture unnerved him. The gun wavered in his hand. What's he doing? Tommy whispered. Shut up, Jake snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Joseph continued his chant, his eyes closed and his face turned toward the sky. He was asking his grandfather's spirit for forgiveness and strength, preparing himself for whatever fate awaited him. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted the confrontation. All 3 men looked up to see 2 aircraft in the distance, flying low and fast across the desert landscape. Search and rescue, Tommy said. They're looking for us. Jake's desperation reached a new level. He grabbed Joseph by the arm and forced him toward the truck. Get in. We're leaving now. I told you I'm not running anymore, Joseph said quietly. Jake pressed the gun against Joseph's temple. You'll run or you'll die right here. Your choice. Joseph looked into Jake's eyes and saw madness there. He realized that his former partner had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Jake would kill anyone who threatened his freedom, including the people who had helped him. Reluctantly, Joseph climbed into the truck. Tommy got into the passenger seat and Jake took the wheel, keeping the pistol within easy reach. As they drove deeper into the desert, Joseph made a silent vow. He would find a way to escape from Jake and turn himself in to the authorities. He would face the consequences of his actions and try to make amends for the damage he had helped cause. But first, he had to survive long enough to get away from a desperate man with nothing left to lose. The truck bounced and jolted over the rough terrain as Jake pushed it to its limits, trying to stay ahead of the search helicopters. In the distance, they could see dust clouds from ground vehicles joining the hunt. Where are we going? Tommy asked, gripping the dashboard as the truck hit a particularly deep pothole. Mexico, Jake replied grimly. It's our only shot now. Joseph closed his eyes and continued his prayers, asking his ancestors to guide him through the darkness that lay ahead. He had betrayed them once, but he would not do so again. Whatever it cost him, he would find a way to make things right. 3 days had passed since Sarah's rescue, and the manhunt for her kidnappers had expanded across 4 states. FBI agent David Chen stood in the hospital room where Sarah was recovering, reviewing her detailed statement for the 3rd time. Her description of Joseph had given investigators their first real lead. You're certain he showed reluctance? Agent Chen asked. That he seemed conflicted about the operation? Sarah nodded from her hospital bed. Despite her ordeal, her reporter's instincts remained sharp. He argued with Jake several times about using violence, and when I mentioned his grandfather, I saw real pain in his eyes. He's not like the others. Agent Chen made notes in his file. The FBI had identified Joseph as Joseph Benally, a 32-year-old unemployed construction worker from Shiprock. His mother was in the final stages of cancer treatment, which explained his desperate need for money. Local tribal police knew him as a good man who had fallen on hard times. "We've put out word through tribal councils that we want to talk to him, not arrest him," Agent Chen explained. "If he really is having second thoughts, maybe he'll come forward voluntarily." Sarah wasn't optimistic. Jake had a gun and he was clearly willing to use it. Even if Joseph wants to surrender, he might not get the chance. Meanwhile, in a remote cabin near the Mexican border, the three fugitives were reaching their breaking point. They had been driving almost non-stop for 3 days, sleeping in the truck and buying food at isolated gas stations. The constant stress and lack of sleep were taking their toll. Jake had become increasingly paranoid, convinced that every passing car contained federal agents. He kept the pistol with him at all times and had threatened both Tommy and Joseph multiple times. The easy partnership they had once shared had devolved into a hostage situation. Tommy was having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. He hadn't slept in over 48 hours and kept muttering about the reporter they had left to die. "We're murderers now," he kept saying. "We're killers." "Shut up," Jake would snap each time. "She didn't die. The cops found her." "We're kidnappers, not killers. Yet," Joseph said quietly, looking at the gun in Jake's lap. The cabin where they were hiding belonged to one of Jake's criminal contacts, a drug smuggler who used the remote location to store contraband before moving it across the border. The man was currently in prison, but Jake knew where he kept the spare key. Joseph had been looking for an opportunity to escape, but Jake never let him out of sight. Even when they stopped for bathroom breaks, Jake kept the gun trained on him. The situation was becoming more desperate by the hour. On the 4th morning, their precarious situation finally exploded. Tommy had found an old television in the cabin and managed to get a local news station to come in clearly. The lead story was about their case. Federal authorities continue to search for 3 men wanted in connection with the kidnapping of Phoenix Tribune, reporter Sarah Mitchell, and the desecration of sacred native American burial grounds, the news anchor reported. The FBI is offering a substantial reward for information leading to their arrest. Sarah's face appeared on screen, looking pale but determined as she spoke to reporters from her hospital bed. "I want people to know that one of these men, the Native American man named Joseph, showed genuine remorse for what they were doing. He tried to prevent violence, and I believe he was coerced into participating." Tommy jumped up from his chair. "See? She's trying to help him. Maybe if we surrender now." Jake's reaction was explosive. He leapt to his feet, waving the pistol wildly. "Nobody's surrendering. We're going to Mexico, and we're going to disappear." "With what money?" Joseph asked calmly. "We left all the artifacts at the site. We have maybe $300 between us. How long do you think we can survive in Mexico as fugitives?" Jake's face twisted with rage. "We'll figure it out when we get there. Maybe we can find work with the cartels." Tommy looked horrified. "The cartels?" "Jake, listen to yourself. We're archaeologists and construction workers, not drug dealers." "We're whatever we need to be to survive," Jake shot back. "And right now we need to be ghosts." Joseph had been studying the cabin's layout carefully, memorizing every detail. There was a back door that led to a narrow trail through the hills, and Jake couldn't watch both exits at once. The key was creating enough of a distraction to give him a head start. His opportunity came when Tommy began crying, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of their situation. As Jake moved to comfort or threaten his partner, Joseph quietly slipped toward the back door. "Where do you think you're going?" Jake's voice stopped him cold. Joseph turned around slowly, his hands visible. "I need some air. I've been cooped up in here for days." "You get your air right here," Jake said, gesturing with the gun. "Sit back down." The tension in the small cabin was suffocating. 3 desperate men, trapped together with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Joseph knew that Jake was becoming increasingly unstable, and that it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. "Jake," he said carefully, "we need to talk about this rationally. The longer we run, the worse our situation gets. Every hour we stay free is another federal charge they can add." "I don't want to hear it," Jake snarled. "You got us into this mess by bringing us to that site. You promised it would be safe, that no one would find us there." "I never promised anything," Joseph replied. "You threatened my mother's life if I didn't help you. Remember?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Tommy looked up from his hands with surprise. He hadn't known about Jake's threats against Joseph's family. You threatened his mother? Tommy asked incredulously. Jake's paranoia reached new heights. Oh, now you're both turning against me? After everything I've done for this partnership? Everything you've done? Joseph's voice rose for the first time. You mean like destroying my ancestors' graves? Like forcing me to betray everything I believe in? Like kidnapping an innocent woman and leaving her to die? Jake raised the pistol and pointed it directly at Joseph's chest. One more word and you'll join your ancestors right now. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Tommy did something that surprised everyone. He lunged at Jake, trying to grab the gun. The two men struggled, crashing into furniture and sending dishes flying. Joseph didn't hesitate. He bolted for the back door and ran into the desert night, leaving behind the sounds of fighting and Jake's enraged shouting. Behind him he heard the crack of a gunshot, but he didn't stop to see who had been hit. He ran through the darkness, guided by moonlight and the knowledge that his only chance for redemption lay in reaching the authorities before Jake caught up with him. The desert was dangerous at night, full of rattlesnakes and coyotes and hidden canyons that could break a man's neck. But it was safer than staying in that cabin. As he ran, Joseph thought about his grandfather's teachings about courage and honor. The old man had been a code talker in World War II, one of the Navajo warriors who had helped win the war in the Pacific with their unbreakable code. He had faced death many times for his country and his people. Now Joseph faced his own test. He could try to escape to Mexico and spend the rest of his life as a fugitive, or he could do what his grandfather would have done, face his mistakes with courage and try to make amends. The choice was clear. Joseph changed direction, heading not toward the border but toward the highway where he could find a phone and call the FBI. It was time to come home and face the consequences of his actions. Behind him, the cabin was silent except for the sound of wind through broken windows. Inside, Tommy lay motionless on the floor while Jake stood over him, still holding the smoking gun. Now look what you made me do, Jake said to the empty room. Now look what you made me do. He was alone now, the most dangerous kind of desperate criminal, a man with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run. The hunt for him was about to become much more intense and much more deadly. Joseph had been walking through the desert for 6 hours when he finally reached the highway. His feet were blistered, his clothes torn by thorns and rocks, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. Each step away from the cabin had felt like a step toward redemption. The first vehicle he saw was a tribal police patrol car, and Joseph knew it was a sign from his grandfather's spirit. He walked into the middle of the road and raised his hands, surrendering himself to the officers who had been searching for him. Officer Maria Begay was the same woman who had rescued Sarah from the excavated grave. When she saw Joseph standing in her headlights, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She had hoped this moment would come, but she knew it meant the young man's life was about to change forever. Joseph Benelli, she asked as she stepped out of the patrol car, her hand resting on her weapon but not drawing it. Yes, he replied quietly. I want to surrender. I want to tell you everything. Within hours, Joseph was sitting in an FBI interview room, telling his story to Agent Chen and a team of federal investigators. He held nothing back, providing detailed information about Jake's other operations, his network of buyers for stolen artifacts, and the locations of other sites they had plundered over the past 2 years. Tommy's dead, he told them, his voice heavy with grief. Jake shot him when he tried to stop him from killing me. Jake's completely lost his mind. He'll kill anyone who gets in his way now. Agent Chen leaned forward. Where do you think he'll go? Mexico? Joseph shook his head. He's too paranoid for that now. He thinks everyone is working with the police. I think he'll try to go back to Phoenix, maybe settle some scores with people he thinks betrayed him. The prediction proved accurate. 24 hours later, Jake's abandoned truck was found in a Phoenix suburb, and security cameras had captured him breaking into the apartment of Marcus Webb, one of his regular buyers of stolen artifacts. Marcus was found tied up but alive, beaten severely but able to talk. He wanted money and a car, Marcus told police from his hospital bed. He said everyone had betrayed him, that he was going to make them all pay. He kept talking about the reporter, saying she had ruined his life. Agent Chen felt ice form in his stomach. Jake's obsession with Sarah was escalating, and she was still vulnerable in the hospital. He immediately ordered her protective detail increased and had her moved to a secure wing of the facility. But Jake was already one step ahead of them. Using Marcus's car and money, he had purchased a hospital orderly uniform and fake identification from one of his criminal contacts. His plan was simple but terrifying. He would get close to Sarah and finish what he had started in the desert. Sarah was reading in her hospital bed when the orderly entered her room pushing a wheelchair. She looked up with a polite smile that died on her lips when she recognized Jake's face beneath the surgical mask. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly, closing the door behind him and engaging the lock. "We have some unfinished business." Sarah's hand moved toward the call button beside her bed, but Jake was faster. He grabbed her wrist and squeezed until she cried out in pain. "None of that," he said. "We're going to take a little trip together. Just like old times." "The guards outside will stop you," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her terror. Jake smiled coldly. "I already took care of the guards. Turns out a fake medical emergency is a great distraction." He was lying about the guards, but Sarah had no way to know that. Jake forced her into the wheelchair, securing her wrists with plastic zip ties he had hidden in the orderly uniform. To anyone watching from a distance, it would look like a routine patient transport. As they moved through the hospital corridors, Sarah tried to catch the eye of other staff members, but Jake's disguise was perfect. He chatted pleasantly with nurses they passed, commenting on the weather and asking about their shifts. It wasn't until they reached the service elevator that Sarah realized Jake's true plan. Instead of going down to the parking garage as she had expected, they were going up, to the hospital's roof. "What are you doing?" she asked as the elevator climbed. "Giving you the story of a lifetime," Jake replied. "The one about the reporter who couldn't leave well enough alone." The roof of the hospital offered a panoramic view of Phoenix, the city lights twinkling in the darkness like earthbound stars. Jake wheeled Sarah to the edge where a low concrete barrier was the only thing between them and a 12-story drop. "This is where it ends," Jake said, pulling out the pistol he had used to kill Tommy. "This is where the story stops." Sarah looked around desperately for any means of escape, but they were alone on the roof. Jake had chosen his location well, isolated with multiple escape routes and no witnesses. "You know this won't solve anything," she said, stalling for time. "Killing me won't change what you've done. Joseph has already told them everything." Jake's face contorted with rage. "Joseph, that traitor destroyed everything." "Years of work, gone because he got a conscience. He was trying to honor his ancestors," Sarah replied. "Something you never understood. Honor?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Honor doesn't pay medical bills. Honor doesn't put food on the table. I offered that fool a chance to make real money and he threw it away for some fairy tale about sacred ground." As Jake ranted, Sarah worked quietly at the zip ties binding her wrists. The plastic was tight, but fear and adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. What neither of them noticed was the figure moving silently across the roof behind them. Joseph had convinced Agent Chen to let him come along when they traced Jake to the hospital. Despite being technically in custody, he had been allowed to help because he knew Jake better than anyone. Joseph had taken the stairs while the FBI surrounded the building, and now he found himself in the perfect position to end this nightmare once and for all. Jake stood with his back to him, the gun pointed at Sarah, completely focused on his intended victim. For a moment, Joseph hesitated. He could simply alert the FBI agents who were no doubt on their way up the elevator, but he knew Jake well enough to know that the man would kill Sarah the moment he sensed any interference. Joseph thought of his grandfather, the code talker who had faced impossible odds in the Pacific. He thought of the ancestors whose graves had been desecrated. He thought of the innocent woman who was about to die because of choices he had made. Then he moved. Joseph rushed forward silently, tackling Jake from behind, just as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun went off, the bullet shattering harmlessly into the night sky as both men crashed to the concrete roof. They struggled desperately, Jake trying to bring the gun to bear while Joseph fought to control the weapon. Years of construction work had given Joseph strength, but Jake was fighting with the desperation of a cornered animal. "I should have killed you in that cabin," Jake gasped as they rolled across the roof. "You should have listened when I tried to talk you out of this," Joseph replied, managing to slam Jake's gun hand against the concrete barrier. The weapon skittered away across the roof and both men lunged for it. Sarah, who had finally freed her hands from the zip ties, kicked the gun further away, sending it sliding toward the edge of the building. The sound of the rooftop door bursting open announced the arrival of the FBI tactical team. Agent Chen and 6 heavily armed agents swarmed onto the roof, their weapons trained on the struggling men. Federal agents. "Nobody move," Chen shouted. Jake broke away from Joseph and made a desperate run for the gun, which lay just inches from the edge of the roof. Joseph threw himself forward, grabbing Jake's legs and sending him tumbling. Time seemed to slow as Jake reached for the weapon, his fingers closing around the grip. But his momentum carried him too far, and suddenly he was sliding over the edge of the building, held only by Joseph's grip on his ankle. "Help me," Jake screamed, dangling 12 stories above the street. "Don't let me fall." Joseph looked down into the eyes of the man who had threatened his mother, forced him to desecrate his ancestors' graves, and tried to murder an innocent reporter. It would be so easy to just let go, to let justice take its course. Instead, Joseph held on, his muscles straining against Jake's weight. "Grab my other hand," he called down. "I'll pull you up." Agent Chen and his team reached them just as Joseph's grip began to slip. Together they hauled Jake back onto the roof, where he was immediately handcuffed and arrested. As the FBI led Jake away, he looked back at Joseph with confusion and hatred. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you save me, after everything I did to you?" Joseph met his gaze steadily. "Because that's what my grandfather would have done. Because it was the right thing to do." Sarah, free at last from her ordeal, walked over to Joseph as the FBI agents processed the crime scene. "Thank you," she said simply. Joseph nodded, then looked out over the city lights of Phoenix. "I have to face the consequences of what I did," he said. "But at least now I can face them with honor." In the end, Joseph's cooperation and heroic actions led to a reduced sentence. He served 18 months in federal prison and was required to perform community service, educating others about the importance of protecting Native American cultural sites. Jake was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for kidnapping, attempted murder, and the death of Tommy Webb. Sarah wrote the story that launched her career, winning a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into artifact theft on tribal lands. But she never forgot the Navajo man who had saved her life twice, once with his conscience and once with his courage. The desecrated burial ground was restored by tribal volunteers, and the stolen artifacts were returned to their proper resting places. Joseph participated in the restoration ceremony, finally making peace with his grandfather's spirit and his own conscience. Sometimes redemption comes not from avoiding consequences, but from facing them with the strength of one's ancestors and the hope of honoring those who will come after. Joseph had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but he had learned it nonetheless.